Today I'd like to look at consciousness. I suppose most of us take for granted that we're conscious, and yet certain spiritual traditions say more or less that we're not conscious, that we've got to become conscious. And then you think, well, conscious of what? In terms of the standard scientific model, consciousness is not really locatable as yet. It's not really a specified dimension or place or location. And yet we can refer to everything we know from childhood, everything we experience, everything we remember and think about, inwardly and outwardly, as somehow being within the field of consciousness. So if we're in the dream, we say, oh, we're conscious in the dream, or if we're walking outside, we're conscious, or reading a book, or thinking our thoughts, we're aware of doing all of that. So in that kind of very general sense, no matter what we do in our psyche, whether we astral travel or travel in a sense into the nature of astrophysics and quantum field and that kind of thing, we're using our consciousness. Or we use the instrumentation that we build with our consciousness, the telescope and the Hadron Collider and such, and we're kind of extending our perception, you might say, through various means, through various cultural expressions. So you can read about quantum mechanics, you can read about astronomy, or you can read about mystical states, and these are experiences by people that are recorded and put in a book, as it were, and that's all part of the human experience, the human condition, or the nature of culture. So any two people can sit down and share their information. It doesn't really matter what it is and what the experience is, because it's mediated by consciousness. So really, everything we ever do, in one sense, is a shared consciousness, in the sense that yes, we have a localized sense of consciousness, and we get together and we communicate, and then you might say, from consciousness to consciousness, we communicate. But that doesn't mean to say our two consciousnesses are the same. Just like our two bodies are separate, and our two memories are separate, and really pretty much all that we are, as it were, is localized around the body. Because if you look at the human condition, we're fundamentally embodied consciousnesses, as it were. I mean, if you get in a car and you travel around, you might say your body and your consciousness go with you. You know, your consciousness doesn't stay back at the house. And you could say when you astral travel, you might be lying asleep in bed, and you go into your psyche through astral travel or Jungian active imagination, and you meet entities like John Lilly in his isolation tank, and so forth and so on. John Lilly thought that the apparitions and the entities, all kinds of beings that he met, he fundamentally thought that they were not objectively real, but more or less thought forms or entities of the psyche, whereas Jung said that he thought, as he said in his Red Book, which is a book of his visions, that probably some of the entities are objectively real, like his own spiritual guide, Philemon. And that's true in the East. I think most Eastern traditions say that you can have a spiritual teacher, a deceased teacher, that you can communicate with in another realm, as it were. Through my own experience, and I've had certain visions, and I've seen apparitions over years in my house, and I've seen UFOs, etc. I would say that in terms of consciousness, I think that consciousness is localized around your body and your brain and memory, and so you might say there's a physical universe outside of your body in a way, and there's a psychical universe that has also an objectivity to itself, so that in a sense your consciousness is with you in the waking state in your body, and looks out into the objective world. And likewise, when you go into your psyche in a dream or in an astral travel, the psyche itself is objected to your consciousness. So as I say, you can take your consciousness with you in an astral journey, and you can take your consciousness with you if you travel in a car. So if we move from what we could say is ordinary consciousness, in terms of, say, walking down by the river. Now, ordinary consciousness is that you're on the bank of the river with your consciousness, and with your eyes you're seeing a swan on the river. And I think that's quite common sense, you know. That's the way things seem to be. And if we move to a more unitive consciousness, which I have all the time, when you look at the swan, for example, or you look at the world in general, then there's a sense of unity. And you could say, well, what does that consist of? What allows you to have this unitive perception? And I don't think the unitive perception is actually to do with consciousness. And when I say that, I mean there's another factor operating to provide that unitive consciousness. And I would say without that other factor, consciousness can't produce unity. So I would say fundamentally that consciousness produces duality of thought, duality of memory, in the sense that the consciousness fabric is actually in a state of fragmentation. So if you go into a library, all the books are separate and in a state of fragmentation. They may be organized. You may, for example, use your memory and say, well, yes, I was born in Oxford, and I lived in Oxford, went to America. And of course you can be chronological and very logical, systematic with mathematics and other things like that. Yeah, it can be very well organized. But it's not the same as what I'm trying to communicate in the unitive consciousness. I mean, unitive perception. I say unitive consciousness because the consciousness isn't not involved. I'm not saying the consciousness isn't involved. Same with the body as well. So you could say whatever you experience in reality, your body and your consciousness to some degree are always involved. In the dream state, your body is involved. In astral travel, your brain body is involved. So I'm not separating the two. Now Jung thinks that the physical body in the physical universe is in coincidence with the consciousness and psyche in another dimension. So that when the physical body dies, you go into the psychic dimension. So he says they work in coincidence. They're not actually connected. They're not directly causally connected. And they work on the principle of synchronicity. So I think he would say that in terms of, say, the atomic structure and the quantum field and that kind of material substance, I think that Jung would see the psyche as it's expressed in the psi field or parapsychology as being quite different from that. And yet there's an interface between psyche and the physical, probably through the psi field. So he's not denying that there's precognitive dreams. So you have a dream and that's actualized the next day in the physical world. So he is seeing a correspondence between the two, and he would say that's a parapsychological effect. So it really is based on the psi field. So I would interpret that to mean that your consciousness that overlaps in the psyche and overlaps in the physical brain and body is involved in a kind of coincidence or telepathic or precognitive connection, so that you dream something and then you experience something in the physical world that's in correspondence. Now, if you dream, say, of a particular person you haven't seen for a long time, and you're walking around the town and suddenly there's that person, and you could say, well, what's animating those two events? What's bringing those two events together? Well, then Jung would say that on the deepest level of the psyche, there's a thing called the psychoid. There's a unconscious or collective unconscious archetypal dimension. And he says that's out of bounds from the psyche as we know it. So the psyche that involves astral travel, there's a limit where you can't go into the psychoid, you can't go into the archetypal realm. So nobody can inquire into that, nobody can go there. And it contains absolute knowledge, and it works on the principle of synchronicity. So the archetype, in a sense, projects a field called a synchronistic field that through the psi field connects the psyche to the physical. So the signal can go from the dream, as it were. The signal comes from the archetype and can produce the effect of a signal of the psyche in the dream and a signal in the physical world that brings that person into coincidence with you that you dreamed of, say, the night before. So we can't equate the psi field or the psyche itself with consciousness. You know, we're conscious in the dream, we're conscious walking around the city, but we're not in control of the dream itself, and we're not in control of the person that we meet. So there's no sense of the ego having any say, as it were, in the way synchronicity works. So again, I think that localizes consciousness and then says, yes, there is something operating beyond consciousness in the physical world and in the psychic world, and that's mediated by the archetypal collective unconscious. So I think Jung more or less sees consciousness in the way I'm expressing it. Now, when we move to this idea of a unitive perception, and you feel a union with the swan, whereas before in ordinary consciousness it's simply a swan, and you know, you're a human being and that's a swan, and they live in a totally separate reality, as it were, a different world, a different space in the universe. This subtle perception of unity, and I'm saying that the unity really is a totality. So the unity is not between two objects, the human being and the swan, but really it may, you might say, in the sense of looking when you're walking down the river, that might be the focal point, you might say, of your perception, because you're looking at the swan, and then you have a unitive sense with the swan. But what I'm saying is that's part of a unitive field, as it were, that involves the totality of everything else around you. So it could be the stars, it could be the sun, it could be a building, it could be the people, anything. So when I go out, as it were, or when I'm sitting here, but when I go out, everything I look at is a totality in unity. And now I move to the next step, and I'm saying that consciousness can't produce that unity. So what does produce that unity? I don't think it's the collective unconscious or the archetype in the way Jung talks about it. So first of all, I will say that I think his model is incorrect. And I would say, whereas he says you're bound to the psyche, that the human consciousness is a product of the psyche and bound to the psyche, so that in a sense the human being lives within the context of the psyche. The human being doesn't even, as a consciousness, doesn't actually live in the physical world and doesn't actually live in the spiritual world. So he's not equating the collective unconscious with the spiritual world in the sense of the Eastern idea of, say, transcendence, the Eastern idea of nirvana or satori, enlightenment. So I would say that in the spiritual dimension, there is the pure oneness, the one mind, as they call it in Tibetan Buddhism. There's enlightenment, nirvana, shunyata, emptiness, and the body of wisdom, dharmakaya. So that's it. That's the spiritual domain, as it were, whether it's a dimension or whatever. It's the spiritual domain. And then there's another level that is the intermediary level of Sambhogakaya, the body of perfect endowment, where aspects of the Buddha can be found, like the Bodhisattva, Maitreya, the incarnation of love, and various attributes like all-discriminating wisdom, or mirror-like wisdom, or Bodic insight, which represents the third eye. So on statues of Buddha, you might see a golden halo that represents the illumination of nirvana, and then you have the third eye, which is the visionary eye of the body of perfect endowment, that involves, you might say, the all-seeing eye of the seer being the body of wisdom. The Buddha in nirvana is the seer. Then the third eye is how you use the seeing of the one and the illuminated one, and the seeing involves the subtle perceptions of what are called the Buddhas of meditation, and that they involve, as I say, Bodic insight, intuitive wisdom, mirror-like wisdom, or discriminating wisdom, and there you might say are aspects that are in a level that is between nirvana and the incarnate body, the nirmanakaya, the incarnate body. So Buddha in effect had the trikaya, the three bodies. When he was walking around the earth, as it were, he could be in the three bodies at once, as it were. And so I would say that the collective unconscious, which is still seen as a part of consciousness and the psyche, I would move that to, you might say, an extension of nirvana, extension of the spiritual dimension rather than the psyche, and or it might be an interface between the psyche and the spiritual. And just like consciousness is an interface, you might say, between the physical and the psychic. And when you go into the spiritual, I think you drop the notion of consciousness and its content, which is the human condition, because then when you're in another level, you're, in a sense, you've gone beyond the strictly human condition. You're no longer a human being in terms of living it on the earth in a kind of natural environment. So I would say that unitive awareness, rather than consciousness, unitive awareness is a product of these subtle perceptions of the Buddhas of meditation, which are the 5 orders of dhyani, which constitute the celestial mandala as a kind of paradigm or a model. So, first of all, without a sense of oneness, without a sense of transcendence, then you might say it's not possible for the attributes of the Buddha to function. So without the seer, there is no seeing, as it were. So we're working from the spiritual dimension and its extension in the more subtle perceptions. And then you come to the psyche proper, and then you come to the body. So when you have a unitive perception, you're in a form of meditation, and that meditation depends on the subtle perceptions of the visionary level of the Buddhas of meditation. So really you are in that realm. When you're in real meditation, you are in that realm. But of course, pure meditation is nirvana itself, the one mind, the clear light of the one mind. So when you're in the diamond body, so we're talking about the diamond crystal. So you could say the third eye that relates to these subtle perceptions is really like a crystal lens, if you want to use that analogy. So it's not consciousness that produces the unity. It's the oneness that produces the unity. I mean, it's not wrong to say, if you say unitive consciousness, it's simply saying that you're conscious of unity, and your consciousness in the way you see everything, your eyes, you can't, in a sense, you can't function in your body without referring to consciousness. And so really you can say unitive consciousness in the sense that you feel a unity, but that unity doesn't depend on what you think. It doesn't depend on what you know. It doesn't depend on conditions of your memory. So all of that's in suspension, as it were. So you could really, it's better to say, I think, unitive awareness. I want to use the word awareness to distinguish it from consciousness. So if I'm looking out of the window now, and it's a blue sky, white clouds, the flag is blowing on the castle, it's kind of a bit, there's been some rain and so forth and so on. Now when I look out, what happens is, because of this unitive perception, everything from my body as I look out in this room, everything I see in this room, everything I see right to the, it could be to the clouds, it could be to the stars. All of that totality of sensation and specification of, say, things I'm looking at, everything is seen together, right? That totality is like one, if you took a photograph, it's like one perception, it's all one thing. But it's not, it can't be one thing unless I have holistic perception, because it's that which holds it together. It's not my consciousness that's doing that. My consciousness isn't holding together the unitive perception, because my consciousness is fragmented. My consciousness is based on memory and knowledge and thought, which is always in a fragmented state, basically speaking. I mean, it may be well organized, but it's still just a kind of archive of information, basically. So, if I go from another position, I'm in a permanent state of oneness, enlightenment. So I'm in the state of oneness. So as I look now, the emptiness of that oneness enfolds the the totality of that unity. So literally everything I perceive through my body and my consciousness in this universe, as it were, as I see it, is in a state of totality and unity, because I see it all as one. And that oneness enfolds the totality of what I'm perceiving. Now, when I mention consciousness, of course I'm conscious, my body's conscious, I'm awake. But that consciousness really has nothing to do with the unity and nothing to do with the oneness. They're coming from their own domain, they're operating from their own domain. The subtle perception in meditation of unity is coming from its own domain. So my consciousness is simply being awake, and the involvement of consciousness in terms of interpretation, of thinking, is irrelevant. It doesn't have to be operating, it's in suspension, and more or less you can switch it off. So as I sit here now, of course I'm speaking now, but you might say I'm using my consciousness in a very, very limited way. I'm not even, as I'm speaking now spontaneously, I'm not really concerned with what's in my memory, what I'm thinking about. I'm just simply speaking spontaneously. And I think that's what probably happens to children. You know, they're so spontaneous, and you know, their memory records the language, they learn how to speak. But basically, like animals, I mean, children are fairly spontaneous. So I would say that consciousness is really to do with processing knowledge and memory. I'd say that's strictly what consciousness is actually all about. And as I say, you take it with you when you travel around the world, you take it with you when you travel around the psyche, in a sense. When you have this holistic awareness and unitive awareness, consciousness doesn't really matter very much. However, when you are very engrossed in memory and consciousness and thinking, when you're studying, and a lot of what you do in your daily life, you go into that, and you don't concern yourself with unity and holism, because they're not under your control anyway. And you don't have to be bothered whether you're aware of those or not, or whether they're with you or not. Of course, they're always with you if they're part of your awareness. But what I'm saying is, if you're deeply involved in watching a film or talking to somebody, etc., you're not concerned with whether you're aware of unity or holism or not. But at any moment, if you wanted to switch to those, they're there. And they're always informing, because of the meditational dimension, as it were, that enfolds your whole organism, because we're talking about transcendence and oneness as emptiness, and that emptiness literally enfolds your psyche and your body and consciousness as a whole. And with these abilities or subtle perceptions like Bodic insight, intuitive wisdom, what Plotinus would call, I think, the intelligible realm, the Neoplatonist, who developed the idea of the one from Plato. Well, the next level, the Sambhogakaya, the archetypal level, would be the intelligible level. So really we're talking about spiritual intelligences. The Buddhas of meditation are spiritual intelligences. So when you're in true meditation and you're at one with the one, yourself is at one with the one, then by implication you're perceiving the world through the medium of meditation. So you're actually harnessing spiritual intelligences. So from that moment on, say from the age of 23, I was fully aware as an intelligent person of the world I was living in. And I just had a profound insight into anything I looked at. So I could be reading philosophy, I could be talking to somebody, looking at nature, and I'd just see, you might say I'd see right through the veil of Maya. I would see, how can I say, I would see in depth, regardless of my consciousness. So whatever consciousness in myself or in another person, say in conversation, that conversation that's produced by the memories and consciousness, etc., that wouldn't interfere at all with seeing in depth, of being in meditation, of seeing, listening, perceiving, right through the very subject that you're discussing. So when you're in conversation, you're sharing limited amounts of knowledge. And you might say, if I'm talking to my friend who's a Jungian scholar, and we're talking, say, for 4 hours, that's a lot of talk. But we share this kind of understanding where it's never about what we're saying. Our relationship isn't based on whether I agree or disagree with the person, or how much we know about each other, or how much we know about a given subject. There's this understanding over 30 years that whatever we say, we know what we're talking about. We know the field of memory, knowledge, experience. We know that human condition in our consciousness, and we're able to penetrate that conundrum, penetrate whatever the problem or the subtlety of that content is. So it could be history, philosophy, mythology, it could be Jung's Red Book, or other things in Jung, or Eastern texts, or ancient Egyptian magic. It doesn't really matter what is in the consciousness as a body of knowledge. Now, it gets more interesting now, because if you think of, you might say, the archive of human culture, that means everything we've ever known on this planet, if you could say store it in an archive, like the Bodleian Library in Oxford or the Alexandrian Library in Egypt. You know, if you think of the whole field of knowledge as an integrated whole, and that when two people are talking that are very well informed, like myself and my friend, that we more or less do have a kind of grasp of, say, the whole field of knowledge, let's put it that way. Not that we don't really know about astrophysics or that kind of thing in science so much, but just say the humanities, the general field of knowledge of arts and philosophy and literature and painting and all that kind of stuff. You might say, when we're sharing that knowledge, we notice the subtleties in what we're bringing to the table, each person from their different perspectives. And you could say there's kind of illuminations in those various aspects of the field of knowledge from a more unitative understanding. So you're using insight to kind of penetrate to the depth, and you see through the veil of illusion, the Maya, which is the limitation of consciousness itself, which is simply what we're actually communicating. But the understanding, the insight, is coming from a meditational perspective that's objective to the psyche and the body and consciousness. Now, if we're weaving together all these various aspects of knowledge, that's the human condition, then you could say we're, because of oneness and because of unity of perception, then in a way something else is operating within us in that communion, you could say, because meditation would be a form of communion. But in that meditation, i.e. pondering the depths, as it were, there's an insight into the human condition. There's an insight into the very nature of knowledge itself, the very nature of the psyche itself, the very nature of the physical universe itself, you could say. Not in the scientific sense, but in a more philosophical sense, in a more unitative, holistic perception. So you could say the next step is the understanding that there is intelligence, and I'm using that in the singular, but you know, in meditation there is this intelligible realm, this intelligence. I think some people might call it the Platonic realm or the archetypal realm. So you see to the depth in the conversation of the human condition if you have a fairly comprehensive grasp of knowledge. And you know, if you go to Oxford or Cambridge, like my friend in Oxford, and I went to the State University of New York, but anyway, the liberal arts programme, and generally you have a fairly good idea of the span of knowledge from Aboriginal to the present. You can anthropology, sociology, all that kind of stuff. So you're learning as individuals about the human condition just by sharing knowledge, and that's a kind of day-to-day thing that you think about. That's just living in the world. And then you move to this other level, which is really, you might say, not strictly to do with the human condition. So you're moving out of, you could say, consciousness specified as the human condition, and you're moving into a level of intelligence that's giving you insight into unity. That is a kind of intelligence that is looking at something quite different than knowledge, you might say. And if you, with that intelligence, with that level of meditation, when you look at the physical universe, as it were, and you look at the psychic universe as a state of unity, then you could say that intelligence, that intelligent perception, is really attuning to the one. So it's kind of going back to the one, you might say, like a full circle. Because the one is the circle of perfection. So symbolically, the Sambhogakaya, the body of perfect endowment, that would really be, represent the one as a circle, as the circle of perfection. And that they often say the circle of the heavens, the spherical nature of the heavens. You could say the harmony of the spheres, or the music of the spheres. Similar idea. So you could say that self-knowledge, which is, I would say, the knowledge of your spiritual life, begins in ignorance because it's bound by consciousness, goes beyond that into a kind of unity, and then inevitably back to the one. But of course, in a sense, that's an illusion as well, because it's the one that's actually bringing all of that about. So you could say within the human condition itself, each person is operating from the one with the illusion that they're a separate ego and identity within their consciousness, with very limited knowledge, until they have unitive perception and intelligent insight. So they're lost in their consciousness, their ego identity, and they think, I'm a physicist, I'm an artist, I'm a philosopher, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a taxi driver, whatever it is. And that's fine, you live your life. I mean, my parents lived pretty much an ordinary life and wouldn't have had a clue about Eastern ideas of unity and holism, all that kind of stuff. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that. And I don't feel sorry for them or think they should be enlightened or that everybody should become a Buddha or anything like that. People live their, you can say they live their karma, they live the life they're living. So that's all that matters. They live their tragedy, and they live their comedy, or they live their ecstasy in whatever way they want. So you go to school, you go to university, and say you study the liberal arts, and you know quite a lot about music and art and philosophy, literature, all of that. And you gain a certain comprehension, you gain a certain perspective on history, maybe a perspective on the wisdom tradition, and you read books and all of that, and you come to your own conclusions, and you see however deep you can see. But from the perspective of knowledge, of the conditioned life, of the indoctrination in society in that limited way, you will produce results. Like in science, they produce new theories and new fashions in art, new styles in literature, etc. And in a sense, it's irrelevant whether they can see with Bodic insight or with the third eye, as it were. It's not really relevant to their particular study of Shakespeare or their particular study of Monet or something in the Impressionists. I mean, no, people can do their PhD on a particular subject, enjoy it, and live their life, and that's fine. They follow existentialism or Sartre, but all of that. Well, I dropped out of college and had an experience of enlightenment, oneness, began reading sacred texts. So you might say there is a specific thing called self-knowledge, as you find in the sacred texts. And there could be another way of looking at it in terms of karma, that there's a self-knowledge in terms of your whole life, everything that ever happened to you. So knowledge of yourself, know thyself, in terms of your whole life, your human condition. Now, the people that see self-knowledge as the theory and practice in terms of what's in books, I think is lacking in unitive and a holistic perception. If you're enlightened and you have access to the third eye, as it were, then your focus is not on anything in particular, but the life you're living. The actual life you're living as a totality, as a unity, as a whole process. And you're not dividing anything, inwardly, outwardly. You're not dividing music from art, you're not dividing philosophy from mysticism or anything like that. And you could call that the Renaissance person, as it were, or the natural philosopher, which means sapien means discernment, being judicious, means a natural philosopher with practical knowledge of the world and understands the rules of wisdom. So we're talking about the sage, the seer, the seer. And of course, the Homo sapien means wise one. So we're talking about the seer that sees the world as a whole in unity and is involved, like Plato, who wrote on all the subjects, like Plato, like his philosophy of the one, etc., and also of the archetypes. So he's seeing with archetypal perception. And what is he seeing? He's seeing the world of knowledge as a whole, as reflected in his own consciousness. Which means your consciousness, it is the world, is the human condition as you see it. Of course, it's limited, you haven't read all the books. And in some way, it seems to me, in some way, the field of knowledge works to bring about a kind of comprehension and understanding of your of yourself in the world as a human being from a karmic point of view that integrates your life, your actual life, your life story, your in terms of self-knowledge, and that would be what I would call a life review. So in a sense you could say you are able to not only self-observe yourself, but self-remember, as Gurdjieff says, that you're membering yourself, which is dismembered in consciousness. You're membering yourself, you're remembering, you're bringing some kind of integration, so that in a sense the knowledge you have about yourself is what you need to know in terms of karma, and it may involve other lives, past lives, that is related to becoming whole, if you want. And this is very Jungian as well. I mean, in his own way, Jung definitely in the individuation process, talked about integration and wholeness. I mean, that was his study of mythology and symbolism. And in fact, his Memory, Dreams, Reflections, I would say, is a perfect example of a life review. I mean, that book is absolutely what he called the symbolic life, what he would call the self-life story, and I would call the life review. That was his life review. And very interestingly, he had a powerful near-death experience where he went into the visionary realm and experienced the hieros, which is the mystical marriage, which is an expression of union. So he did in effect go to the visionary realm and experience unity. And he actually experienced Zeus and Hera, father and mother, and in Tantric Kundalini, that's Shiva and Kundalini, who unite as father, mother, dyad at the crown of the head. So the Ajna chakra, the sixth chakra, Kundalini, the serpent, unites with Shiva in the seventh chakra. And in that state of meditation, the yogi can then give birth to itself from its own consciousness. As I say, Buddha is born of Maya. Buddha leaves his consciousness, therefore he's reborn out of the fabric of his own consciousness, which is the human condition, which is his karma. So he reached the end of his life story as karma, and he could enter into transcendence and be liberated, as it were. So when you're growing up, like myself, and I didn't know anything about karma or life review, and but nonetheless, I mean, as a child, you become interested in certain things, and you feel, oh, I'd like to do art, or I'd like to travel to Africa, or I'd like to meet so and so, and stuff like that. And so, yes, I mean, in a sense, you are searching, you are looking, you're learning, but of course, then it gets focused in consciousness in the sense of the study of Shakespeare, or you're going to become a diplomat in Africa or something. It becomes focused, it becomes localized in that sense, and the ego identity, as it were, living that out. I am a diplomat, I am an artist. The I am is the identity of the ego living itself out in the world, and with no background of unity or holism. There's no sense of the self as the one. Now, if you have an awakening, and you have an awareness of the one, you have an awareness of enlightenment, and you have access to the third eye or Bodic insight into the field of consciousness, as it were, then you're looking for something else. You're not looking to become anything, you're looking for something else. You're no longer identified with ego, because you can discriminate between self and ego. And that's what Jung more or less said, in the sense that he saw the Freudian ego not as the self. He gave a deeper level meaning to the self. And in fact, he linked it to the archetypal realm. And although he didn't write about the one, he didn't write about the spiritual dimension in itself, and more or less he said we live within the psyche. Nonetheless, with his collective unconscious, at least he was indicating some other process operating. And so from that level of oneness, I began to read the sacred texts, and I immediately understood what I was reading. So in terms of knowledge, I could always understand what I was reading. I just had that kind of insight. And that's true with poetry, music. I can usually penetrate to the numinous essence, as they say in Jungian psychology, the numinosity of, say, the divine presence, the aura presence of the divine, as it were, or the one acting through the intelligible realm, or the subtle perceptions. And when you're looking from the level of the self, you might say, well, what are you looking for? And I would say you have to understand that as karma, as a process which is not consciousness bound, as it were. It's not bound to culture as we know it. It's a different kind of experience. So if you've lived before and you're being reborn again, then there's a continuity of consciousness, in the sense, I wouldn't say consciousness, I say there's a continuity of essence. And that essence is the meaning that you distill from life to life, if you will. And so really you're trying to connect to your essence, the self-essence. And they refer to nirvana as the Buddha essence. So you could say the subtle perceptions are the essence of Buddhahood. So in terms of personhood, the person you are, and the individuality you are, then that essence is carried over. So in Jung's near-death experience, he said that he found himself floating above the earth, and he said that there was a stripping away of his conditioning. It was very painful, but something remained. And he said what remained was my life. Everything I've lived on the earth, in essence, the distillation of the meaning of that life, which of course involves knowledge. It would be a form of self-knowledge. And everything I've distilled alchemically, as it were, I'm taking with me. So when they refer to the Buddha essence, I don't think nirvana is just a blank sheet of emptiness, as it were. No, I think there is a process, because they say in Tibetan Buddhism, Buddha travelled beyond that into other levels. Maybe that was a home base. Maybe the one is the one, and you can incarnate, or you can go to other levels. where maybe other things are going on besides incarnation and reincarnation. Maybe there are other abstract domains, as it were, that we know nothing about, because all we know is dogma in a book. You know, and all we know is that, yes, we may have unitive perception, holistic perception, and be aware of the one, but that doesn't mean to say that is the absolute ending of everything, and that's the final thing, and that's the end of the show, as it were. I mean, there's no authority that, no one has the authority to say that anyway. So you're looking, when you listen to music, when you read a book, from the point of self-knowledge and unitive awareness and holistic perception, you're looking for a connection within that poem, a connection within a sacred text, connection within the place you live, connection within the people you know and your childhood, you know, whatever it is. You're looking to distill an essence of meaning, which is kind of non-verbal. It really goes deeper than what we call knowledge. It goes deeper than consciousness itself, even though language and knowledge is mediated by consciousness, just like music is mediated by the senses. But nonetheless, the numinous essence. Now, the person that coined the word numinosity, Rudolf Otto, in the idea of the holy, he referred to that as mysterium tremendum. So he referred to the numinosity of the holy other. So God, nirvana, oneness, Buddhahood or Christhood would be the holy other, something so different, so wholly other than psyche, body, consciousness, work, physical world. And he said that the experience of that is the mysterium tremendum, which fills you with fascination, awe, and terror. So when I had my awakening, all three of those were present in my awakening. There was the fascination, like what's going on, it's incredible, it's like unbelievable. And then there's the awe, that it's overwhelming, it's quite powerful, it's traumatic in a way, and it's an experience of the void from the perspective of consciousness. It's awesome, the void, like looking into outer space, as it were. And then terror, it is the void itself. When the ego consciousness looks at that, experiences that within one's being, it's not only overwhelmed, but it's in danger of annihilation, as they say. And then if you can stay with that, you enter the clear light of the one mind. So the distillation of your cultural experience, as I say, the human condition as a cultural experience on this planet, because just as a tree produces fruit, the apple and such, well, I believe that the human being is producing culture. That's our nourishment, food for thought. That's our nourishment on any level. So when they say the Buddha essence, I think Buddha took with him the essence of his personhood, his soul essence, as it were. So Buddha, the person Buddha, the individual self Buddha that was liberated, still had, you might say, to travel to other dimensions or other things. I believe he does know himself in essence, which is non-verbal. It's not like you're carrying a book with you, although in that realm of the Bodhisattvas and the Buddhas of meditation, they do have a Buddha that actually carries the book of wisdom, which is the book of the sacred text, which is the book of visions, the book of self-knowledge, of course, that's revealed to you through the third eye. So consciousness is simply a function of the organism, like the senses and everything else. It seems to me produced by the psyche when it interfaces with the physical body. So wherever the consciousness came from that first entered the kind of human species, the animal body as it were, from that psychic dimension, in interfaces, it serves that purpose. It serves the purpose of connecting to the physical domain. And then the culture, knowledge, thought gets channeled into the organism, brain, whatever, and we don't really know whether the memory is strictly a brain function or the memory is also a psychic function. I think it is a psychic function. Of course, everything interfaces with the physical organism, but I think the memory is a psychic function, and consciousness, etc., knowledge and thought and language. So like Jung says, we're speaking and thinking and all of that in a body, but we're not necessarily connected to that body directly. So consciousness is how we identify things, how we live in the world, and know that we're living in a particular house, know that we've read a particular book, and so forth. We're processing culture, and year by year history unfolds, and whatever happens with science, whatever happens with music, they're quite independent, and people are quite free to believe in those things if they want to. And something might change their mind, maybe it will, maybe it won't. So when it comes down to it, from a position of spiritual awareness, consciousness is no different from a book. Consciousness is, just like there are characters in the book, well, there's your character personality within your consciousness, the various states and moods and beliefs and opinions and all these different things that build up. And that's easily like shed. You think, when you're in full holistic perception or full unitive perception, consciousness is fairly irrelevant. But from the position of the ego, in ordinary consciousness, it's like not only fantastic what the spiritual tradition is saying, but it's dangerous, of course, because it means that this numinosity, this suggestion of the void and transcendence, quite threatening. So I feel that's one reason why the occult is a taboo in Western society. And occult obviously is hidden knowledge. That's the real meaning of it. So you could say the wisdom tradition is an occult tradition that's taboo because of the danger to the ego. So those people that have created the censorship through the ages, from the Greek tradition, as it were, especially Christianity in the West, they're afraid. It's based on fear. People aren't conscious of the reason, they're not conscious of the reason why there's the taboo, but it is basically fear. And when you're one, there is no psychology, there is no consciousness, there is no fear, there is no authority, there is no even tradition, there's no belief.